Hello and welcome to We Can Work It Out, the podcast that explores the history, present and future of workers' rights. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Lord. In each episode, we'll be delving into the stories, struggles and successes that have shaped working lives. From friendly societies to people management, we welcome academics, activists, trade unionists, policymakers, writers and workers themselves to help us understand what fair work really means in a changing world. This episode's guest is David Torrance, one of Britain's most respected contemporary political historians and biographers, known for his ability to make complex, constitutional and political history accessible to wider audiences. A writer, journalist and historian, his work has explored some of the most significant figures and turning points in modern British political life, combining rigorous archival research with a highly engaging narrative style. Over the course of his career, David has written extensively on British politics, monarchy, constitutional change and national identity, producing acclaimed biographies and historical studies on figures including David Lloyd George, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, as well as works examining the Union, devolution and the evolving nature of the British state. His writing is widely recognised for its clarity, balance and attention to political detail, making him a trusted voice on both historical and contemporary political issues. In his latest book, The Edge of Revolution, The General Strike That Shook Britain, David turns his attention to one of the most dramatic episodes in 20th century British history. The book re-examines the general strike of 1926, not simply as an industrial dispute, but as a moment when Britain came dangerously close to constitutional crisis, political rupture and social transformation. Through vivid storytelling and careful historical analysis, he explores the tensions between organised labour, government power, media influence and political opinion during the 9 days that brought Britain to a standstill. David's work is particularly valued for its ability to connect historical events to contemporary debates, showing how questions around democracy, economic power, inequality, and collective action continue to shape British society today. His scholarship combines deep historical knowledge with an accessible style that appeals to both academic and general audiences alike. David, welcome to We Can Work It Out.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, David. Before we kind of get stuck into the general strike itself and the book that you've written, can you tell the listeners a little bit more about your background and what you drew towards writing about the general strike in 1926?
Sure. I'm actually a former journalist. So for the past 8 years, I've worked in the House of Commons library as a constitutional expert, although happily that has allowed me to carry on what I call my side hustle of writing about 20th century British politics. Yeah, both the day job and the side hustle are hugely enjoyable. As I always say to people, I get paid to geek out about really interesting things. I guess the General Strike book flowed from a book I published 2 years ago, which was on the first Labour government in the UK. That was called The Wild Men. As you can tell, we go in for provocative titles. That was a centenary book, as I say, 100 years after the first government was formed. And the publisher and I were keen to sort of follow that up. And I thought, oh, well, I should do the general strike. The centenary is coming up. And I didn't actually know a huge amount about it. I had obviously come across the references in my reading over the years. So it was a bit of a voyage of discovery for me. But to me, that's part of the fun of being a historian.
Yeah, you've written some really interesting books, and like you said, it's kind of that kind of the nature of what you've written about previously has come into your new book, The Edge of Revolution. Why did you choose that phrase then, and how close do you believe this is a really good, interesting first question for you to get stuck into? So, the title Edge of Revolution. Why did you choose that phrase, and how close did you believe Britain actually came to a constitutional or political crisis during the strike?
So it wasn't actually my choice of title. It was going to be called 9 Days in May, but there is a competing work by Professor Jonathan Schneer, an American historian from Oxford University Press, also a very good read. I think there was a bit of inter-publisher sort of negotiation, but we lost. So we had to come up with a different title. And someone at the publisher came up with that. I think I probably would have been more comfortable with a question mark at the end of it. But I think it works because the point is, at the time, there was a big body of opinion which genuinely thought this was a revolutionary moment. So calling it The Edge of Revolution, I think we get away with that. And it was the same with the previous book on the wild men. Now, the ministers in the first Labour government were not, by and large, wild, but a lot of people thought they were or could be wild. So I guess both titles have leaned into to the discourse at the time, if you like, what people were saying and thinking. Was it a revolution? No. A revolution needs revolutionaries, and there were precious few of them 100 years ago. There were some syndicalists in the miners' federation, and more broadly. So syndicalists, broadly believe in replacing capitalist economy with a worker-led economy, but it was very much a minority view. It was essentially a very large, sympathetic industrial dispute. Now, that did have much broader ramifications than a regular industrial dispute. But as I explore in the book, the framing of the strike as a sort of challenge to Parliament or the Constitution was a very skillful bit of political narrative, political storytelling by Stanley Baldwin and others, but it doesn't mean it's true.
Do you think that it would be remembered for a heroic act of solidarity or a failed challenge of the state, or to the state, sorry?
It's remembered in lots of different ways, sort of taken to saying that there is no single general strike. There are lots of different strikes. In the immediate aftermath of the strike, it was remembered largely by volunteers as a sort of triumph of solidarity, a sort of wartime coming together in defense of the country. But equally, I think it's come more recently to be remembered from the other side as what it was. It was a remarkable display of solidarity from the figures are imprecise, but between 1.5, 2 million workers who were not miners, but nevertheless risked their livelihoods, their pensions, their working futures out of solidarity, out of sympathy with the miners who had been locked out of their pits at the end of April 1926.
To understand the strike, then, what was going on at the time and prior to that? Because these things don't just happen, do they?
No.
They're kind of a build-up. So what was going on politically, economically, and socially during the period prior to the general strike in 1926?
Yeah, so there was a sense that this had been inevitable for quite a long time. Even before the First World War, you can find the Times talking about growing industrial organization and the threat of as they put it, a challenge to the elected government. And both sides prepared accordingly. So the government of Lloyd George in 1920 passes the Emergency Powers Act, which is very much geared towards sort of keeping essential services going during some sort of large strike or other national emergency. The Trades Union Congress reorganizes, they form a general council, the Big Three is formed, the idea of combining the three biggest unions. Economically, flowing from the First World War was considerable economic instability, not only domestically, but internationally. And that, of course, impacted both sides. It impacted miners in terms of their wages, and it impacted the coal owners who were in a rather more comfortable position, but it nevertheless impacted their profits. And they, of course, acted to maintain those by extending the hours of miners and also reducing their pay. So by the mid-20s, all of this is sort of coming to a head. And it's important to note there is general sympathy at the time for the miners, and that's cross-party. The general strike, however, is much more contentious when it comes to public opinion. But as I say, there's the feeling of a head of steam, and both sides sort of view almost as inevitable some sort of clash between capital and labour. Indeed, John Maynard Keynes, after Churchill returns the UK to the gold standard in 1925, he talks of a war, and that's his word, as being inevitable.
When he says war, what did he mean by war?
He was probably being as melodramatic as we have been with the title of the book, but he was essentially speaking to that general view that some sort of clash, some sort of large scale strike, and some sort of response from the state was something which was bound to happen as a result of all these.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite harsh language, that, isn't it? This is the kind of a war, and I suppose that's how some politicians probably viewed it as well.
Yeah, well, and also at the time, the First World War is not that old. The Russian Revolution is only less than a decade ago. The Irish Revolution and War of Independence is a very fresh memory. So 1920s was a very dramatic period, and that's very much reflected in the political discourse.
We're going to come on to that because obviously you've written in your book about the Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution and the concerns from the monarchy as well, but we'll come on to that later if that's okay.
Of course.
Can we just focus on coal a little bit? Why was it so important or politically explosive at the time?
Coal was central to the dispute. Indeed, the general strike at root was about coal. To understand that, you need to remember that coal was central to domestic usage at the time. People used it to heat their homes. It powered trains, which people used to get to work. It powered power stations to generate electricity. And economically, coal exports had been an extremely important part of the British economy. And also in terms of the labour force, 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 of working age men work in coal mines at that time, which is an astonishing statistic. And
It
of course,
is, yeah.
dependent upon them were hundreds of thousands of women, children, and broader families. So if there was a dispute within the coal industry, that was noticed in a way that's probably quite difficult to think of now. Although I'm just old enough to remember, first of all, the miners' strike in the 80s, and also my grandmother, one of my grandmothers at the time, still used coal. She had a coal cellar, and that was stocked up once a week. So these things are, it's not as distant as it might appear, but it was central to everything. The miners had a relatively good run in the First World War. The industry was under quasi-public ownership. Their wages had been protected. Turmoil on the continent, particularly in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, had meant that British exports were doing quite well and were profitable. However, a sort of ironic byproduct of Ramsay MacDonald's first term as Prime Minister in 1924 was his peace deal, basically between France and Germany, which meant that the German coal production revived and then presented another challenge to the UK. I guess it's the law of unintended consequences. But also the gold standard, as I say, returning to that, again impacted exports and made them more expensive. So yeah, coal was central to the general strike, even though paradoxically, if you like, during the strike itself, the coal miners were not on strike. They had been locked out of their pits, but on strike out of sympathy with them were the Transport and General Workers Union and the National Union of Railwaymen, which was a lot, millions of work.
You mentioned the First World War, and it was obviously still sharp in people's memories at the time.
Yeah.
How influential do you think the ramifications and what happened during the First World War and subsequently, how do you think that shaped attitudes on both sides of this dispute?
It's funny, at the time, there's evidence in the discourse that it reminded people of the war or a sort of wartime spirit, a sense of coming together out of solidarity in defense of the nation. And actually that went for both sides, but that permeates letters and diaries and articles at the period, allusions to either the beginning of the war in 1914 or its end in 1918. And as I've already said, the economic, political and social ructions sparked by that conflict were very much playing out during the 1920s, particularly in 1926.
And was there a big fear about a revolution happening in the country? I know from reading your book and a few other books, Jonathan Schneer, that you've mentioned as well, there did seem to be a bit of a fear of a revolution happening in the UK against the monarchy in particular. Do you think that had some kind of influence as well?
Yeah, I mean, this had been around since the late 19s because of the Russian Revolution, which of course had been covered quite extensively in the UK. The fear is there in 1924 when Labour take office for the first time, and it's completely ridiculous from today's vantage point. It was a very weak minority government, and the creed of Labour at that time was quite centrist. But you have to remember that people were used to largely upper middle class, aristocratic Tory and Labour governments. So the sight of working men in the corridors of power was quite unsettling. And that feeling hasn't really gone away by 1926. And you also have to remember the sort of media atmosphere of the period. The 24 election campaign is remembered for the Zinoviev letter, which was essentially a faked letter purporting to be from a senior Soviet official sort of instructing communists in the UK to start a revolution. But a big chunk of public opinion believed that kind of thing, and it caused huge resentment with the Labour movement for obvious reasons. And politically, Conservatives, the Daily Mail and others would play on that fear, just as, today it's a perennial of politics. Politicians play on what they judge the mood to be. And so it was used quite cynically, but quite effectively throughout the in a very political fashion.
Moving on to the strike then itself, how quickly did everyday life change for not only the miners, but for people that were linked to the industry, families of the miners, and life in general? How did it change for people on an everyday, day-to-day basis?
Well, so the strike begins at a minute to midnight on the 3rd of May. So the first full day of the strike is the 4th of May. Obviously, for the miners, they're not working. They've been locked out several days before, essentially being blackmailed into accepting different terms and conditions in return for actually being able to work. So within those communities, obviously, there's no work going on in terms of mobilization. Families have organized soup kitchens and all the usual sites associated with that. But for the rest of the country, I opened the book describing what the BBC called the Great Trek, which is thousands of people walking, roller skating, cycling, even riding on horseback to get to work in central London. London then, as now, was a major financial centre. So for some people, it was a bit of a novelty. This was not something that they'd experienced before. Traffic jams in central London, not many motor cars in those days. And again, that brought to mind for some a memory of the First World War, in that it reminded them of a disruption to normal life, of a sense of crisis and emergency situation. And that lasts throughout the 9 days. Also, the lack of newspapers, at least on the first couple of days. That doesn't mean so much now because, of course, our news is consumed digitally. But then newspapers were the information technology of their day, and people very much, they took several newspapers a day. Indeed, there were several editions of certain newspapers every day. Such was the desire for news. So that was really noticed and frustrated a lot of people. And also the lack of public transport. So, as I say, people had to walk to work or get a lift through any means possible. Eventually, during the strike, you have a degree of volunteer-run trains and buses and so on, but nowhere near a proper service, despite some of the propaganda at the time. So yeah, unless you lived in a rural part of Britain, and the strike incidentally didn't extend to Northern Ireland, unless you lived in a non-industrial rural community in England, where perhaps you didn't notice very much apart from the lack of newspapers, normal life was noticeably and quite significantly disrupted.
We'll come on to the media later, because I know there's lots of propaganda and other things that went on with the media as well, on both aspects of how you view things. But in terms of Stanley Baldwin then, and his kind of leadership style, he comes across, I think, a bit calmer, definitely, than Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
How do you assess Baldwin's leadership style, or how he portrayed himself and how he acted at the time?
So Baldwin viewed himself very much as a peacemaker. So there'd been a notable incident the year before where a sort of diehard or right-wing Tory backbencher had tried to legislate to end the political levy, which would have had a significant financial impact on trade unions. Sensing that the mood was febrile, Baldwin used his sort of personal authority to appeal for that to be withdrawn, which it was. So Baldwin viewed himself as a peacemaker, a centrist, a moderate who could bring together sort of different factions or sections of British society at that time. So in that respect, as I argue in the book, the general strike presented a significant challenge to his view of himself, because obviously a general strike was not something which a politician of that sort would desire. Although Baldwin was of the view, and this was a mainstream view in the Conservative Party, as I said earlier, that this almost the boil had to be lanced, if you like. There had to be some sort of confrontation with the Trades Union Council. Nevertheless, there's evidence that he's under huge strain during the general strike. The government at one point even has to rebut a story that he's had a nervous breakdown. I don't think it was that bad, but he was certainly he knew that this was a serious situation, and that if the strike succeeded, then his political career would be over. But I'm more critical than most have been of Baldwin. I mean, he's done very well out of the general strike in historical terms. Not only do I think he's slightly culpable for it happening in the first place, in that there's lots more he could have done in terms of pushing the coal owners, whereas there's a sense he just sits back in sort of March and April and lets it run its course. He also loses the peace. He loses control of the Conservative Party in 1927. And he's pressured into introducing punitive trade union legislation. And ultimately, he loses the 1929 general election. Labour doesn't quite win it, but they are the single largest party. So politically, I don't think Baldwin emerges as well from the general strike as perhaps previous historians have argued.
And what about Churchill? Just coming back to Winston Churchill, then, it's fairly controversial, his role. And, you've mentioned about, using the term war. Was Churchill genuinely prepared for confrontation on a bigger scale than maybe Stanley Baldwin?
Yeah, and actually he sort of almost relished it. I think he'd written as early as the 1910s about, a clash like that. And it's interesting because, of course, the popular view of Churchill is irredeemably that of him as the great wartime leader in the Second World War. But there are other Winston Churchills. And the Winston Churchill in 1926 was a recent convert to the Conservative Party. He's Chancellor of the Exchequer. But there's a sense of him almost, dare I say it, as a Boris Johnson type figure at the time. He's got obvious talents, but a lot of his colleagues view him as a sort of uncontrollable loose cannon who needs to be managed. So Baldwin later remarks to a biographer that the cleverest thing he ever did was put Winston in charge of the British Gazette, which was basically a government-produced propaganda sheet during the strike. And not least because he calculated that would stop Winston Churchill, although he wasn't entirely successful in this respect, stop Churchill interfering in other aspects of the strike where they feared that his quite belligerent, die-hard nature might cause more trouble.
How organised and prepared was the government then compared to the TUC?
Hugely well organised. So not only was the Emergency Powers Act in place since 1920, but in the period between Red Friday, as the TUC called it, in 1925. So that's when Stanley Baldwin agreed to a 9-month subsidy to maintain miners' wages. In that 9-month period where Baldwin had essentially bought some time, the strike could have happened a year earlier. The government led by Sir William Johnson Jicks, who was the very reactionary Home Secretary, he used that time very well to make sure the emergency machinery was in order, government structures such as the Supply and Transport Committee, and also encouraging sort of a volunteer organisation of people who can maintain public services. So by March, April 1926, he's reporting to the cabinet that everything is pretty much in place. The TUC, by contrast, are curiously underprepared. Walter Citrine, who's the acting general secretary, emerges as a very impressive figure from the period. He's been chivying the TUC, the General Council, for some time to take this seriously. He's been monitoring conservative rhetoric, conservative government announcements, and it seems clear to him that something is coming. But although the TUC is clear on sympathetic action in support of the miners, day 1 and day 2 at Eccleston Square, the then TUC headquarters, ironically Winston Churchill's former house, all the evidence we have from that is of absolute chaos, of people rushing around, no clear sort of lines of command. And Ernest Bevan, who's General Secretary of the TGWU, he sees this and very quickly tries to get a grip on it. And he succeeds to a certain extent. And by day 2, 3, the TUC is ticking over much more effectively. But yeah, there's no question. And indeed, it was remarked upon at the time by trade unionists that the government was clearly much better prepared than they were.
Did the strike expose divisions within the labour movement then because of what they were doing, or because of the this perceived incompetence or the caution?
Yeah, very much. I mean, although there was general sympathy with the miners, there was frustration with the miners' leaders. So Arthur Cook was the very sort of charismatic leader of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain. But he was also seen, I think, a little unfairly as sort of intransigent, uncompromising. The other union leaders in the big three, so Bevan and Jimmy Thomas at the National Union of Railwaymen, they viewed the miners' slogan, "Not a penny off the pay, not an hour on the day," as quite unhelpful, because it meant that compromise was almost impossible. So although there was agreement at the sort of high level to go on strike in support of the miners, there was a feeling that something had to give. and that the miners, just as much as the coal owners who were equally intransigent, had to compromise to some degree. And that frustration grows over the 9 days because the Miners' Federation view is very much, we just carry on with this for as long as possible. Whereas Ernest Bevin is quite clear from the start that a general strike can't really last any more than 2 weeks, not least because it's depleting quite rapidly trade union funds. But more to the point, it's never quite clear what victory looks like for the TUC. Vaguely, broadly speaking, it was presumably fresh negotiations over miners' pay and conditions. But beyond that, it was an amazingly ill-formed or ill-conceived strategy.
You've mentioned the media before, and it's really interesting because it feels like a kind of a remarkably modern media battle between the government and those in the dispute. How important were newspapers in general when they control information at this period of time as well?
So newspapers are hugely important. It's the main source of information. And indeed, that's why printers are included in the first wave of strikers. The press at this time is overwhelmingly hostile to Labour, the Labour Party and the Labour movement. I think it's only the Daily Herald, which is pro. The Guardian at that time, the Manchester Guardian, is still very much a liberal newspaper. Although I think the Times, to be then as now, broadly speaking, tries to be fair, at least in its news coverage, and that was acknowledged at the time. But yeah, the printers went on strike. There's no news. The government fills the vacuum by organising the British Gazette, which ostensibly has Churchill as editor. Remarkably, the first edition appears on day 2 of the strike, despite the lack of proper professional printers, so they're reliant on volunteer labour. The TUC responds on day 3 with the British Worker. That's edited by Hamilton Fyfe, who's quite a posh Edinburgh journalist who's usually at the Daily Herald, but a very capable journalist. And yeah, you basically have a propaganda battle. And broadly speaking, the Gazette is more successful in terms of sales and speed. I think the consensus at the time is that the British Worker was editorially the superior of the two, less inclined to fabrication. The BBC is also important. It's caught at the time between being a private concern, the British Broadcasting Company, and becoming more of a public corporation with a royal charter, as it did in 1927. But it means that John Reith, who's the general manager, soon to be director general, is very conscious that they're in a sensitive position. Churchill basically wants to take over the BBC and turn it into sort of a broadcast version of the British Gazette, as Reith sees it. Reith wants more public service broadcasting to emerge from this. So he basically has to compromise. And it's not quite full propaganda. The BBC wireless reports are balanced in that they report both sides. But the pressure from government is such that when the Archbishop of Canterbury asks to broadcast an appeal to end the strike, he is refused. And even more remarkably, when Ramsay MacDonald, the leader of the opposition, asks for a right of reply to Stanley Baldwin's broadcasts, again, he is told no. And if you read both the Archbishop's appeal and Ramsay MacDonald's speech now, they're utterly innocuous. The idea that they were being prevented from saying something incendiary is preposterous. But as I say, the BBC at the time was in quite a precarious position. And in Reith's judgment, he had to do that in order to allow the service to survive.
Do you think John Reith and the BBC did maintain neutrality, looking back on it?
Not neutrality as we would now understand it, no.
No.
Indeed, now the BBC has obligations in its charter and through other documents where it has to be impartial. And, for example, if the Prime Minister broadcasts today, the Leader of the Opposition has a right of reply. It's inconceivable that would be refused. But also, interestingly, the BBC in 1926 did not gather its own news. It purely summarised sort of Reuters and the Press Association. It did not have journalists who were out in the field. However, the strike changes that. So it has a lasting impact on the BBC. Their reporters begin to gather their own information, independently verified. And indeed, there's a dedicated unit for doing that, which is set up as a result of the strike.
You mentioned in your book about John Reith. I think you go through what at the end of the strike, somebody quotes when the TUC surrendered to the government. The quote from your book is it's really interesting. The craggy Scot Reith recited Blake's Jerusalem as he concluded. The orchestra came in with full orchestra and chorus. Yeah. Is that Is that why people look back at it and think, well, he wasn't that neutral and he was fairly close to the cabinet
Yeah, well,
border?
I mean, I guess what he was doing there was sort of playing on a sort of patriotic mood that
Hmm.
somehow the state had survived the onslaught. Yeah, which is not neutral. It's also completely absurd to think about the BBC doing something like that now. Interestingly, it was recreated by so no recording of that exists, but it was recreated in 1932 for a documentary about the BBC moving to Broadcasting House. They were at Savoy Hill at the time. So if BBC Archive on 4 from a couple of weeks ago actually has a clip of John Reith reciting Blake with the orchestra swelling in the background, and it sounds completely ridiculous.
In terms of the human side of this story, because it is a human story, and I think, your book and other books that I've written recently about it do try to get that point across. It is a human story where people are affected. In terms of, first of all, the public opinion, then, do you think most people did support the miners at the time, or do you think people supported the government or just wanted stability? What's your kind of overall perception of people's opinion at the time?
Yeah, it's a difficult one on one level because there's no opinion polling as we're now used to. I think that doesn't really kick in until the 90s. So you have to judge it from other sources, which is obviously what a historian does. As I say, I think there was general sympathy with the miners, cross-party, cross-class, even up to the king, who had a sort of instinctive sympathy with the underdog, and the miners were certainly underdogs. Beyond that, it's harder to judge, although I think on balance, the majority were probably against the strike, even those who didn't see it as some sort of revolutionary act, because it disrupted public life. And, your average human being at the end of the day wants to get on with their business undisturbed. And, that's familiar to a modern audience, I think, from the pandemic and the sort of accompanying frustrations at that time. But there were dissenting voices. I found a fascinating letter from a deputy governor of the Bank of England in one archive. He's a knight, a sort of upper middle class Scot. He's working in a very establishment institution. But in his diary and letters to friends during the strike, he's very much of the view that the strikers have a point, that indeed the whole economic system is creaking under strain, and from their perspective, he can completely understand what's going on. Although that's a rare note of empathy, I think, from someone like that. Amongst the student volunteers, who were a conspicuous presence, Hugh Gateskill is at Oxford at the time. This is his political awakening. He decides that he's not going to do what most of his contemporaries are and volunteering to help the government and unload food supplies. He's going to deliver copies of the British Worker on behalf of the TUC. So it was a political moment, the general strike, which mobilized actually lots of leading figures who came into their own after the Second World War. Jenny Lee is a miner's daughter at Edinburgh University, a very unusual thing in 1926. She's very active on behalf of the local strike committee. But as I say, in general terms, I think public opinion was against the general strike specifically, and there was huge relief when it.
How important were women during the strike and the lockout, both politically and socially?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, the trouble with politics in this period is it is very male dominated, but there are female voices. I mentioned Jenny Lee, who leaves a very vivid account. Ellen Wilkinson is dispatched by the TUC to sort of tour striking areas to boost morale and speak at meetings, and also report back to London on the mood. Beatrice Webb's very caustic diaries provide, as ever, a very entertaining, if not completely accurate account of what's going on at the time. And obviously in mining communities, women, not just during a strike, but women were absolutely central to those. Sort of middle class or upper middle class, indeed aristocratic women were also important on the volunteer side of the strike. And the press at the time is full of reports of, titled ladies running basically canteens in Hyde Park. Hyde Park at the time turned into a huge sort of government-run complex. And also even at the Times newspaper, duchesses were helping to sort of load newspapers. And there was a sense of everyone mucking in, which again speaks to that sort of wartime spirit, which was much alluded to.
Because you've got a chapter called Blacklegs, haven't you, in there about those who did break the strike. Were they volunteers who wanted to kind of support the strikers but wanted to make sure the country ran? you sometimes you've labelled it, the upper class who wanted to kind of stick it to the strikers. Was there a general theme with the people who did break the strike from where they came from and what their motivations were, or was it all singular?
No, again, it's much more nuanced than you might think, although perhaps my book is guilty of not quite capturing that. The most visible volunteers were, as I say, middle class, perhaps because the media at the time took an interest in them. There would have been thousands of regular working class people who perhaps sympathized with the miners, but instinctively felt that they needed to help out. And there would have been others who were unemployed and simply welcomed the prospect of a week or two's much needed pay and something to do to break the monotony. So yeah, the motivations of those volunteering at the time cannot be sort of generalized. There were lots of different things going on, I think.
Were there regional differences as well in how the strike unfolded across Britain and the reaction to it?
Yes, to some degree. As I said earlier, it doesn't extend to Northern Ireland, which is interesting. And indeed, I have quotes from Northern Irish politicians saying this is very much a mainland affair, and we hope it won't, contaminate the peaceful province of Northern Ireland, which is only a few years old by that point. In Scotland, you have the Scottish Office, which is a government department which has existed from the late 19th century. They're very much left to sort of organise things their own way. The Lord Advocate, who's a law officer, is put in charge, and he's quite incendiary. He's talking about a revolution of the Russian sort and how he must do everything in his power to stop it. And that's interesting because the rest of England and Wales was divided up into 10 regions, and they were headed by civil commissioners who were part of the emergency machinery, if you like, and they were all junior ministers of the crown. It's quite interesting their differing approaches. Some of them see themselves very much as administrators who are just, keeping essential supplies moving. Others, like the Lord Advocate in Scotland, are much more pungent and propaganda-led, and they see themselves as being at the front line of the resistance to a revolutionary act. And that does shape the tenor of the strike in different parts of the country. And in the northeast of England, where you have certain very red or militant communities, there is almost a complete breakdown in sort of relations between the civil commissioner there, Sir Kingsley Wood, a future Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the local strike committee or council of action, which is basically run by communists. I don't think I'm exaggerating in saying that. So yeah, obviously in predominantly industrial areas, the strike would have been much more obvious than it was in more rural parts of the country.
We mentioned the title of the book, The Edge of Revolution. You have got you found some interesting correspondence between, I think it was the King and the Prince of Wales that you've cited about their concerns about what was going on and it being they thought it was being led by communists. How involved did the king or the monarchy get involved with trying to resolve it or having an opinion on it?
The king, so King George V, he's much more involved than you might think. And again, it's interesting from today's perspective, where obviously we're repeatedly told that the monarchy is apolitical and is not involved in day-to-day government business, which is essentially true. Not as true 100 years ago. George V, as I say, he was sort of caught between sympathy for the miners, but as a former naval officer, he had what one biographer called a lifelong antipathy to disorder. He liked everything to sort of work in an orderly fashion. He gets a daily briefing from a senior minister at Buckingham Palace. He's in London throughout. He's chivying the government into introducing more emergency measures, and he thinks that what they have in place is inadequate. At one point, he asks the Home Secretary if he couldn't arrest a few trade unionists for making what he regards as incendiary speeches. The Home Secretary very diplomatically says no. But on the other hand, when the government tries to get the king to approve an order in council, so that's a piece of legislation at the Privy Council, restricting the flow of funds from the Soviet Union to the miners, the king balks at this and says, this might be regarded as incendiary, and I'm worried that this will push people over the edge. So the king's a bit all over the place, but he is highly engaged with the strike. He's incredibly worried about the strike, not really in terms of his own skin, although that is alluded to on occasion. It's more because as head of state, he has an admirable concern about the condition of that state and the condition of industrial relations, the economy, all the rest of it. And it's clear from his diary and other documents that he feels that very deeply. And his relief when the strike is over is palpable.
Moving on to the end of the strike then, why did the strike end so suddenly from your perspective? Because it was only 9 days, the general strike. I know we'll talk about what happened to the coal miners afterwards, but why did the general strike come to a sudden end, do you think?
There's a combination of factors. I mentioned earlier that Ernest Bevin is quite clear it can't last for more than 2 weeks. On day 2 or 3, he starts looking for an off-ramp. Sir Herbert Samuel, former High Commissioner in Palestine, he reappears on the scene. He chaired a royal commission on the coal industry before the strike. He goes off to Italy to try and write a book about philosophy, which doesn't really work. And when the strike breaks out, he comes back to the south of England. He makes contact with Jimmy Thomas at the National Union of Railwaymen and basically offers himself as a mediator between the government, the coal owners, and the trade unions to try and reopen negotiations. The crucial thing is that the government stand aloof from that. They say to Herbert Samuel, you're quite welcome to speak to whoever you want, but you have no official connection from us. The General Council of the TUC, however, sort of convinced themselves through wishful thinking, I suppose, that Samuel does have authorization and that whatever he comes up with will be put into effect. And so that gives them confidence, if you like, to call off the strike in the apparent belief that that the lockout notices will be withdrawn, that the other striking workers will be reinstated without any penalties. But of course, the government's given no such assurance. And so when the strike ends at 12 noon on the 12th of May, there's lots of descriptions of how haggard and drawn the Prime Minister looks by that point, which speaks to, I think, the stress he was under. The TUC actually think they've won, and they release an unhelpful statement to that effect. But it quickly becomes clear particularly to Ernest Bevin, standing in number 10, that they've screwed up, basically, that they've placed far too much emphasis on Herbert Samuel's quite modest proposals, and in fact they've got nothing.
Do you think the TUC leadership lost confidence in its ability to win, or were they more fearful about something larger developing?
So Jimmy Thomas in particular from the NUR was of the view that he was very fearful of things getting out of hand. But it was more the internal tensions between the big three, I think, which re-emerged. So when Samuel comes up with a compromise, which does involve consideration of wage cuts, but as a quid pro quo for reorganization and another commission and all the usual paraphernalia, the Miners' Federation just say no, like we cannot accept any of this. And in the late night meetings on the 11th of May and on the morning of the 12th of May, there's real frustration from the TGWU and the NUR about this. And they basically decide to break with the miners. They say, look, it's now got to the point where we will call off the strike. If you want to carry on, feel free, but we cannot keep this up. And so that has huge ramifications internally. And indeed, judging from the TUC's mailbag on the 12th and 13th of May, and this is all at the Modern Records Centre in Warwick, local strike action committees, councils of action, and so on, were just apoplectic, confused. They couldn't understand why it'd been called off. To them, it was going quite well. If they did understand it being called off, they couldn't understand the lack of conditions, the lack of commitments from the government. And of course, the Miners' Federation is furious with the others for what they see as another act of betrayal.
One thing that your book does raise, which I've not really read in other books about the general strike, is the religious leaders. You mentioned the Archbishop, who was a bit more, I'm going to summarize, more peaceful in his nature of trying to resolve things. But didn't the Roman Catholic Church, didn't they kind of say this was a sin? Didn't one of the cardinals say it was a bit of a sin to go against the government and to strike? Yeah,
there's a fascinating ecclesiastical dimension to the strike, which I was very keen to tease out more. Because in the 1920s, people were church-going, faithful types, and the church leaders were much more important then than they are now. So that this did have an impact. The Archbishop of Canterbury is Randall Davidson, fascinatingly born into a Church of Scotland family in Edinburgh, like me, but then sort of drifts over to the established Anglican church. He has form for intervening. He's intervened over Irish Home Rule, over the sort of battle over the budget in 1909, 1910. And so to him, the natural thing to do is to get involved. Together with other Protestant churches or nonconformist churches, he comes up with a peace plan, which is pretty tepid by today's standards, but it infuriated the government. They viewed the leader of the established church as somehow being sort of a bit weak, a bit too flaccid, almost sort of crypto-socialist in his leanings, all of which is ridiculous. By contrast, Cardinal Bourne, who's leader of the Catholic Church, Archbishop of Westminster, he preaches on the Sunday during the strike that it's a sin against God and the constituted authority, by which he means the government. Judging by their respective mailbags, it splits opinion in their respective churches. A lot of Anglicans view the Archbishop, like the government, as being weak and they think he should be standing up to forces of revolution. Whereas the Cardinal has deeply offended working class, often Irish strikers in London who write to him saying, why on earth are you shoring up the government and the established forces who are currently pulverizing us during this important period? But at a high level, there was basically a battle over adherence. And there is anecdotal evidence of some Anglicans converting to Catholicism as a result of that. And what Bourne was doing in particular was trying to demonstrate to the government that Catholics were loyal, if you like, that they were not out to sort of threaten the state. And of course, in that context, the Irish question has only very recently been settled. And so politically, perhaps Bourne felt he needed to make some sort of intervention along those lines.
The miners continued fighting for months, didn't they, after the general strike ended? Why were they effectively left isolated, and what was the outcome for them as well?
Yeah, so as I say, the other two unions decide to break with the miners who refuse to compromise. So the lockout notices are not withdrawn, even though the general strike is over. And therefore, the miners are out until, in many cases, November, December that year. So there's it's not a strike, technically speaking, but the coal stoppage or dispute carries on for another 6 months. By the end of the year, you have breakaway unions who are willing to negotiate. But by December, I think all of the miners have gone back to work, crucially on lower pay and longer hours. So they are, in essence, completely defeated. The other unions just felt that there was nothing more they could do in terms of persuading them to compromise. The government does its best to bring forward more proposals. They legislate in certain respects against the wishes of the coal owners. And interestingly, as the miners' lockout continues, actually frustration amongst Conservative government figures with the coal owners increases. And even Churchill comes to the view they're an impossible set of sort of very intransigent, very wealthy men.
Yeah, there's a lot of criticism against the owners of the coal mines and how they behaved as well. That's something which I think everyone kind of agreed upon then and looking back now.
Yeah, Lord Birkenhead's famous quote was, he referred to them as the stupidest men in England. Although ironically, they're generally Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish, but you know what he meant.
Sometimes that gets confused, doesn't it? Or wrongly, I know, yeah. So my final question about the general strike then is, looking back, do you think the strike was doomed from the beginning?
Doomed might be a bit melodramatic, but essentially yes, because as I said earlier, it was not clear to the TUC what victory looked like. Strategically, it was ill-formed. And therefore, to some extent, they blundered into something. And actually, an important point is that they were sort of bounced into it. A point I missed earlier on is that during the negotiations between the government and the TUC, printers at the Daily Mail refused to run an editorial which attacked the dispute as a revolutionary act. The editor phoned this to the cabinet, to Number 10 during these negotiations, and certain figures in the cabinet used this as a pretext to call off the negotiations. There was at that point a general expectation a strike would be averted and some compromise put in place. So to some degree, the TUC were bounced into it. But the fact, even accepting that they didn't really have a clear view of an end game of what victory looked like, that's on them. And indeed, there was a lot of internal criticism. All the unions and the TUC generally, they have post-mortems in 26, 27, and all these criticisms are aired. So it wasn't just external forces, the media, political opponents saying that. It was also other trade unions.
Okay, we ask every guest the same final two questions. What are you working on next?
So the next book And I sort of see this as a trilogy. As I said, the first one was on the first Labour government general strike. The third book will be on the second Labour government of 1929 to 31 and the financial crash of 1929. And I've already started working on that, which of course will end with what people still call Ramsay MacDonald's great betrayal, where he forms a national government. So I'm looking forward to maybe looking at that through a slightly revisionist lens. Yeah, but that won't be out till 2029. So I've got some time to work on that.
It's nice to have a bit of time to write a book. I've
Absolutely,
got 2 by the end of the year, so I'm trying to meet those deadlines at the moment. What a fascinating piece of time of history, which I'm not an expert in that time period, but it doesn't seem to get looked at that much, I don't think. So it'd be interesting to see what your lens is that you look through.
The 2 world wars, the two world wars tend to dominate, and they sort of blot out the sun. And so the interwar period, the 1920s, which, as you say, and I agree, is a very interesting period, it's tended to be a bit neglected. So no, I'm having a very interesting time sort of bringing that period back to life, if you like.
We also ask each guest to widen this to not only one person, but you can choose a person, a group of people, or an event which you believe has influenced the world of work. Who or what would that be and why?
I think I'm going to say journalists. I was a journalist for a very long time, and it remains a hugely important body of people who work, by and large, very hard to find out what's going on, explain it to everyone else. And they often do so, as I know from personal experience, on pretty poor pay and conditions. And even though the nature of journalism has changed immeasurably from 1926 to now, I still think it's a hugely important source of information, and therefore a very important group of workers, not just in the UK, but around the world.
That's really good. I'm glad you've chosen Jones, because I completely agree with you. I think it's been diminished in terms of the importance of journalism, of investigative journalism as well.
Yeah.
But, I think the freedom of speech for journalists and the pay in terms of conditions, I think, has been diminished. And it's a source of control by whatever elements of trying to control things. So
Indeed. So just obviously we had elections last week. I used to work for Scottish Television. They were on strike on election day, which meant that STV did not have any election coverage, and it was left to BBC Scotland. Now, on one hand, I get why they chose that day to go on strike. But on the other hand, that diminished, as I say, that exchange of information and very valuable analysis. But yeah, no, journalists are still hugely, hugely important.
Okay, good stuff. Well, I highly recommend your book, The Edge of Revolution, The General Strike That Shook Britain. We'll put some links in for the listeners to click on that and hopefully go out and buy that, because it's a fascinating period of time. It's a great kind of what we call lens that you look at the period as well. Really, really great research you've done it as well. So we'll put some links in for the listeners to access that. But David Torrance, thank you very much for joining us on We Can Work It Out.
Thank you very much for having me.